gave gifts according to the king's bounty. Now, the name of the sermon is called Not Just Another Pretty Face. Now, Esther wasn't just another pretty face. There was obviously something else. There was a movie, and I couldn't find it. I tried. It was this movie, Barbara Streisand, as I thought, starred in it. And the movie was about a very plain woman who had a sister who was exceptionally beautiful. And the plain woman, who was played by, I just mentioned her name and now it's gone. Anyway, point was she played a plain woman and she didn't dress up, she didn't look after her hair, she was a wonderful, kind woman, but pretty wasn't her thing because she couldn't compete with her sister who was exceptionally beautiful. And so a man particularly wanted a wonderful woman, but he didn't want a pretty woman. He specifically didn't want a pretty woman. There's a song that's out about married to a pretty woman, and everywhere you go you look, because every man wants her, and so he didn't want any of that. He didn't want her spending time on vain things. He wanted a woman who he could live with. So anyway, time passes. They have a happy marriage, and time passes, and she reaches that, what men call the, you get old and you say, well, I want to retain my youth. And so she decides that she's going to exercise to get fit. She's going to do her makeup. She's going to learn how to dress so that she can take advantage of as much beauty as she has. And her sister, who is now also in that age group of 45, tells her a secret. She says, when you're a beautiful woman and you go into a room, you look around the room of 50 or 60 other women and you say to yourself, I'm the prettiest one here, or I'm the second prettiest one. I'm prettier than all these other women. And when you're 26 and you're very beautiful, that happens because there's a mix of different women in the room. But when you're 36, it's harder. And maybe you're the fourth most beautiful woman. And it took more time. And when you're 45, maybe it's that diminishing rewards. It just doesn't get better, it gets worse. And it gets worse every year. And she said, just telling you that the beauty is fleeting. And besides that, her husband was mad at her because this is what he signed up for. So she went back to the way she was. Now, the reason I tell you that story is that Esther had other things. She was not just a beautiful woman. Now I want to look at the text. The first point is the conceited are taken down the peg. In Esther 2, verse 2 and 3, it says, then the kings, well the story is that the third year of the reign, he has a great party, and at the end of the party, he's pretty well drunk, and he calls Vashti, the queen, in to show her off, and she refuses to come. And so they come up with they take her out as queen. In chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, it says, then king's attendants who served him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers over all the provinces of his kingdom, that he may gather every beautiful young virgin to the city of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the woman. Now, there's 127 provinces. Do you know how many women that would be? These guys would be appointed to find the most beautiful virgins, so maybe each one found 5. 5 times 100, and that's a lot of women to be transported. We don't know how many it was, but you can figure it was plenty. Anyway, as a beautiful woman who was in a village, she would be the most beautiful woman in that village. And she would be the top of the heap, but all of a sudden, she'd be transferred to a whole bunch of other women who are all very beautiful. A rose growing among dandelions is easy to spot. You say, that's a rose. But a rose among roses is just like any other. And so all these beautiful women would be transported to this one place, and it wouldn't be the same as being the only beautiful woman in a village. You would be one of many, and you would recognize how certain people groups from the 127 provinces, some would have bigger lips, some would have bigger noses, some would have, and they would recognize that maybe they're not as beautiful as they thought. And of course, there was only one prize. They thought this might be easy. They were going to be transported to, and they were the most beautiful woman. But they arrived, and there was hundreds of beautiful women. And now it's, you see, with one prize, it's really hard for these women because they know that they have to compete. It's a cutthroat, only one winner. Winner takes all. Well, that couldn't have been the way Esther did it, because if you look at verse 2, verse 9, you need something different. We just read that. Verse 9 said, and the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, and so he quickly provided her with the cosmetics, and if you read on the verse, he gave her everything. He wanted her to win. Now why? Now, if you think about this, it's really hard to please a eunuch with beauty, because a eunuch is a man who has been specifically castrated so that he doesn't care, he doesn't think about women in the same way as a man who wasn't. And besides that, if he decided that he was going to pretend he liked women, the king would cut off his head. So he's not going to be, female wiles and charms are not going to change him. So Esther had to come up with some other way, and she seemed to do it immediately. It makes me think that she had something special that the other women didn't have. In verse 10 and 11, it goes on to say that she hadn't told anybody who she belonged to, that she didn't tell anybody she was a Jew, because Mordecai specifically told her not to, and she obeyed. And then in verse 11 it says that Mordecai came every day and looked and saw her. So not only was she obedient to her parent, who was Mordecai, she was also loved. He came every day to see how she was doing. It's a picture of us as we obey God, and he's always present and available to love us. Well, number 3 is extreme pressure and a really bad deal. Now, in verse 14, 2:14, it says, in the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem. Now, here's what these women what was happening to these women. They would go into the king. If he didn't like them, they would end up in the custody of another harem, and they would never be called again unless they particularly were favored by the king. And you have to think about this. These are young girls. They may have been 14 or 15, and they'd never been with a man before. This was the first time. This may have been, they may have understood how things would happen, but they never experienced it before, and it would be uncomfortable for them. And not only all of that, but they had to prove to the king that they were the best, the most beautiful. And it was a really bad deal, because one of the things is the queen, all these girls were brought from their family, taken away without the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to go. They were just scooped up and taken. And so now they would be homesick. And there's something that you need to think about is that this didn't happen in a few days. They spent a year before they got to see the king. There would be hundreds and hundreds of them. And if you continue on, and Esther, in her case, it was 4 years before she got to see the king. And things happen to people. I can remember there was a young girl who was her father was a friend. But when she was 16 at Hillside Church, she was the most beautiful girl you ever saw. And she was one that you would look at and look at again because she was just beautiful. And I saw her when she was 22. She wasn't beautiful. She was okay. She wasn't extraordinary. And things can happen over a course of 4 years where you're lonely, you have no friends, and if you make friends, that they're transported to another harem and you lose them, and it could be that all of these things combined, you were no longer that beautiful virgin that was picked up and brought to the palace. Here's the problem, is that this is not a fair system. There's only one prize, and mostly everyone's going to lose. Now, just so that you know the timeline, Esther 1:3 is it's in the 3rd year of the reign, and the king has a 180-day party and then the queen disappoints him, and they remove the queen, and then they decide to bring all these virgins in, and in the 10th day of the 7th month, basically 4 years later, Esther gets to go into the king's presence, and he chooses her, and she becomes queen. And then Mordecai tells Esther about a plot, about somebody wants to kill the king, because he overheard this. And she tells the king, and the king, it's marked down, but he never gives him any credit for doing this. And then in the 12th year, Esther 3:7, in the 12th month of the 12th year, Haman has spent a year coming up with this idea how to dispose of all the Jews. So she's been the queen for 5 years. And in verse 4:11, it says, it's been 30 days since she's seen the king, and it's an off with your head if you arrive without the king summoning you. So, it's the last point is for such a time as this. Esther 4:14. In verse 4:14 it says, this is what Mordecai says to Esther. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arrive for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have attained royalty for such a time as this. Mordecai is saying, look, what are the chances of you being the one that has been chosen? Maybe you were chosen so that you could save your people, because you have an option of going before the king, and he may not kill you, he may listen to you. Anyway, in verse 16 it says, so she said to the people, you fast, and then I'll go, and if I perish, I perish. She may have been the first Jew to lose her life. And then in Esther 5:2 it says, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Now, I think the king recognized that when Esther came and appeared before him, this was something serious. You don't come for something frivolous. If you're a selfish person, you want to protect your life above all else. And she would know that if she showed up for some frivolous thing and lost her life, well, so he would understand that, and he would recognize that and appreciate her courage and nobility. And asked her immediately what was the trouble. And so she succeeded, because she acted unselfishly in this whole thing. Now, to this point, I've honored the text, and I haven't mentioned God once, because if you read through the whole book of Esther, it's kind of like one of those things where you know that there's a punchline, and you have to figure it out. Well, this is an amazing story. What's behind all this amazing story? Well, it's God, but it doesn't say it's God, and you have to figure that out yourself. You have to recognize that God has been working actively through this whole thing to protect his people until they returned again to the land of Israel. So I'm going to paint this picture for you. Esther lost her parents, and Mordecai took over for them, and he did quite well, and it seems like he was a bachelor. It doesn't say he wasn't, but it seems like he is. And so she's scooped up with all these other girls, and she's brought to the palace, and she's been offered this prize, but the chances of winning it are small. But for some reason, everyone likes her immediately. She must have been that type of person. And years pass, and one after one of all these women fail. And it's 4 years later she gets to go see the king, and she succeeds where all the others have failed. And you have to ask yourself, why did she succeed? What was special about her? Why did the king see? Was it her goodness, or her maturity, or is it her independence, or her willingness to give him what he needed, not what was the only thing that people expected that he would want? It would be a sexual. She would be more than all of those things. Now, she ended up saving the Jews from death, and she is the picture of a perfect bride. The absolutely what he wanted in a woman. Even though he didn't know, she fulfilled all of those things. She was the example of a perfect bride. And you know that the groom, the king, wasn't any of these things. But she managed to, 5 years later, when Haman was going to destroy the Jews, she came forward and she revealed herself as a Jew, and she revealed that she would be killed too by this horrible person. And at this point, the king really loves her. He has forgotten about her after 5 years maybe, and he's forgotten some of the things that he appreciated about her, but when she came forward and risked her life, he remembered all those things. And so he truly loved her, and when he discovered that he was going to lose the queen because Haman had come up with a way to get her killed, he was furious. And he goes out because he's so furious, and he comes back in, and Haman has thrown himself on the queen, and he says, "Will you violate my wife in my presence?" And that was the end of Haman. The servants take him, grab him, put a bag over his head so the king can't even see his face, and he's hung. Well, the prophets in the Old Testament use lots of word pictures of God as the bridegroom, the perfect bridegroom, and the bride is Israel. And the bridegroom is perfect. The bridegroom, but the bride is awful. Israel is awful. Israel keeps going after other gods. So this is the reverse of the picture of Esther. Esther was perfect. Everyone recognized how wonderful she was and how not wonderful the king was. He was willing to let Haman kill a whole group of people, and he didn't even ask. When Haman came and said, look, there's a group of people who aren't alike and they're causing trouble, let me just kill them all. Okay, whatever, fine. He didn't ask. It was his job to ask these things. He didn't. Well, in the New Testament, Jesus is the groom, and the church is the bride of Christ. And there's all sorts of passages in the end in the Revelations that talk about this. 19:7 and 8 says, let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And then it goes on in 21 verse 9, it says, and the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls and full of the 7 plagues came and spoke to me and said, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And in verse 22:17 it says, the Spirit and the bride says, come. Let one who hears say, come. And let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who wishes to take the water of life without cost. Jesus has said, I'm the bride. I'm the groom. You're the bride, the church. And it's as opposed to there was only one winner with Esther, God is saying, look, the bride is the church. You can invite, you can bring as many people as you want. The bride can be huge. And so, God said, Jesus said, look, I'm the bride. I'm the groom, and I want to rescue the bride, and this is what I'll do to rescue the bride. I will die on the cross. That's what we're celebrating in a few minutes. And so, God has called us not to want comfort so much. See, we want comfort in our worship, in our person, in our theology, but God calls us to dig deep and recognize that the bride of Christ is anyone who comes to him, and we can bring his message of his love to anyone, and they can too can join and be part of the bride of Christ. Let's pray.